Welcome. As you settle in tonight, drop a quick comment below where you're listening from and what time it is there. There is a phone call that changed the world, and almost no one alive today has heard a recording of it. It was placed in the spring of 1953 from a sandstone building in Washington, D.C. to a basement in central Tehran. The man on the Washington end had a Roman numeral after his last name and the president's full confidence. The man on the Tehran end was the grandson of an American president, the son of a war hero, and a CIA officer working under diplomatic cover. The conversation was brief. The instruction was simple: overthrow the Prime Minister of Iran by August. The price tag for the entire operation came to about $11 million in today's value. For the price of a movie, the United States bought itself an enemy that would still be paying it back in blood and oil and headlines 73 years later. Tonight, you are going to hear something almost no one tells in one piece: the entire history of the United States and Iran. From a hospital bed prime minister in 1951, to a drone strike in 2020, to a cruise missile streaking over Tel Aviv in April of 2024. 75 years. 13 American presidents, 2 Iranian Supreme Leaders, and not a single decade of peace. Welcome, Midnight Magnates. This is Mr. Calder. As the world goes quiet, we step into the shadows to uncover the stories that built our world. If you enjoy listening or falling asleep to the hidden history of power, fortunes made, and the human nature behind the price of greatness, then this is the place for you. If you like these episodes, please check if you've rated the show. It helps more than you know, helping new viewers find us, and helping me to make better videos for you all. Find a quiet, comfortable place to relax. Find the warm edge of the blanket, or the comfort of your favorite seat. Let your shoulders drop. And let's begin. The year is 2020. The date, January 3rd. The time in Baghdad is 12:47 in the morning. 2 black sedans pull off the access road of Baghdad International Airport. They are leaving the International Arrivals Terminal. Inside the lead sedan is a man in his early 60s with thick grey hair, a closely trimmed beard, and a calm expression. His name is Qasem Soleimani. For the past 22 years, he has been the head of the Quds Force, the foreign operations arm of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. There is a photograph in the New Yorker of him standing in a doorway in Lebanon, wearing a dark sweater, looking like a tired uncle. There are videos of him visiting Iraqi militias, kissing fighters on both cheeks, smiling with his eyes. He is, depending on whom you ask, the second most important man in Iran, the architect of every Shia proxy in the Middle East, the patron of every road to American grief, from Beirut to Sana'a, the commander who outmaneuvered 3 American presidents in 3 different wars. Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, has just told a closed briefing that Soleimani has more American blood on his hands than any other living person. 6,010 miles away, in a windowless room at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, a young captain is watching a thermal imagery feed. Above the convoy, an MQ-9 Reaper drone is flying at 20,000 feet. The Reaper has a wingspan slightly larger than a Boeing 737's tail. It is silent. It is loaded with 4 AGM-11 Hellfire missiles. It has been waiting for the convoy for several minutes. The order to fire was signed by President Donald Trump on a piece of paper after a meeting at his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida. The order was sent through Central Command, then to the Joint Task Force in Baghdad, then to the operator in Nevada. It travels at the speed of light. The convoy travels at 30 miles per hour. The first Hellfire enters the lead sedan from above, then a second, then a third. The vehicle is incinerated. So is the second sedan. Soleimani is killed instantly, along with Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, the deputy commander of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces, and 8 other men. His DNA will be identified in the morning by the unique design of a ring he wore on his right hand. Within 72 hours, Iran will fire ballistic missiles at 2 American bases in Iraq. Within 10 days, an Iranian air defense battery, on edge and undertrained, will mistake a Ukrainian passenger plane for an American cruise missile and shoot it out of the sky over Tehran, killing all 176 people aboard. Within 3 months, the world will be locked indoors with a virus that, depending on which country's intelligence agency you believe, may or may not have arrived in time to interrupt a war. Neither side knew how to stop. Mohammad Mossadegh did not look like a revolutionary. By the time the Western world began paying close attention to him in the summer of 1951, he was a 69-year-old aristocrat who delivered his speeches in pajamas. Sometimes he wept. Sometimes he fainted. Sometimes he received foreign ambassadors from a hospital bed, with a blanket pulled to his chin and a glass of water on the nightstand. Reporters from Time magazine, who would later name him their Man of the Year, found him strangely moving in person. They could not decide whether he was a saint, an actor, or a very old man who had simply stopped pretending to care what other men in suits thought of him. His credentials were almost preposterous. He had been born in 1882 to one of the noblest families of the Qajar dynasty. His mother was a princess. His father was the finance minister of a king. He had been sent to Switzerland to study, where he became one of the first Iranians ever to receive a doctorate in law. He came home and began a career of stunning consistency. He resisted the Russians. He resisted the British. He resisted the Pahlavi monarchy that replaced the Qajars in 1925. He spent years in internal exile and then years in retirement, watching from his study as a country he loved sold its most precious resource to a foreign company at terms a child could see were unjust. By 1951, the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, had finally had enough of those terms. They turned to the one man in the country whose hatred of the British concession was longer than living memory. They named him Prime Minister. He accepted. And then, with the same mournful weariness with which he had refused every prior position, he picked up a pen and signed the document that nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The British, who had been pumping oil out of Iran since 1908, lost their largest single overseas asset in the time it took to read a piece of paper. They did not take it well. We will get to what they did about it. But first, You have to understand exactly what they had been doing for the previous 43 years. In 1908, an Australian-born British speculator named William Knox Darcy struck oil at Masjid Soleiman in the southwestern province of Khuzestan. His company, eventually renamed the Anglo-Persian Oil Company and later the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, would become the world's largest oil enterprise. The British government, under Winston Churchill's energetic encouragement, took a 51% stake in 1914. The Royal Navy converted from coal to oil. From that moment on, Iranian crude was British naval power. The arrangement was, on paper, a partnership. Iran received a 16% royalty on net profits. In practice, it received much less because the books were kept in London and audited by Englishmen, and the rest of the profits were sent back to the British Treasury, which collected a higher rate of tax from AIOC than the company paid Iran in royalties. The arrangement was, on the ground, a settlement. The Abadan refinery on the Persian Gulf was the largest in the world. It was run by British engineers who lived in air-conditioned villas with tennis courts and golf greens. Iranian workers lived in mud huts with no running water. Signs in the workplace read, "No dogs, no Iranians." The Iranian average wage was roughly 50 cents a day. A British accountant earned several $1,000s a month and paid for his cocktails with company scrip. This was the empire as it actually was, in plain view, in 1950. There was no concealment. There was no apology. There was the crown jewel of the British Empire, sitting on Iranian soil, paying Iranian workers what amounted to 1,000th of what it paid its English ones, and shipping the proceeds to a treasury several thousand miles away. Mossadegh had been demanding for 40 years that this end. By 1951, it was no longer a personal grievance. It was the dominant emotion of an entire country. When the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company refused, in late 1950, even to renegotiate the royalty split towards something approaching parity, the Majlis decided that the only way to make the British listen was to stop listening to them. On March 15th, 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the entire oil industry. On April 28th, they appointed Mossadegh prime minister. On May 1st, he signed the law into effect. The British response was immediate and incandescent. They withdrew their technical staff from the Abadan refinery and refused to allow any of their personnel to assist in continued operations. They imposed a worldwide embargo on the purchase of Iranian crude. They took the dispute to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, demanding it order Iran to return their property. They quietly began moving Royal Navy assets into the Persian Gulf, drawing up plans for an amphibious assault that would have made the Suez Crisis look polite. Truman, the American president, told them to stop. He was a Democrat, just out of a war that had killed 500,000 Americans. He had no intention of starting another one over a foreign oil company. He sent his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, and a special envoy, Averell Harriman, to Tehran to mediate. Harriman came home empty-handed. Mossadegh would not budge. The British would not budge. But Truman would not let them go to war. And neither would anyone in Tehran budge. So for 2 years, the Iranian oil sat in the ground, the Abadan refinery sat idle, and the dispute went into legal arbitration. Then in November 1952, something changed. Dwight Eisenhower won the American presidency. The new Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles, whose brother, Allen Dulles, ran the Central Intelligence Agency. The Dulleses listened to a different kind of argument. The British, by now desperate, no longer led with oil. They led with the threat that Mossadegh, a constitutional nationalist who had spent his life resisting communists, was somehow going to deliver Iran into the hands of the Soviet Union. The two-day party, Iran's communists, were small but loud. The British took the loud and turned it into the certainty. The Dulleses bought it. Eisenhower bought it. By April 1953, a covert operation had been authorized. The man chosen to run the operation in Tehran was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt and the cousin of Franklin Roosevelt. He arrived in Iran in July 1953 on a forged passport. The British called the operation Boot. The Americans called it TPHX. History calls it the 1953 Iranian coup. It was the first time in the post-war period that the United States deposed a democratically elected foreign government. It would not be the last. The budget was approximately $1 million. The plan was to flood Tehran with bribed mobs, bribed clergy, bribed newspaper editors, and bribed army officers. Roosevelt operated out of a basement, paying out cash from a duffel bag. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was supposed to issue royal firmans, dismissing Mossadegh and appointing a general named Fazlollah Zahedi in his place. The first attempt, on August 15th, fell apart almost immediately. A loyalist colonel learned of the plot and arrested the imperial guards sent to deliver the firman. The Shah, in a panic, fled the country, first to Baghdad and then to Rome. By the morning of August 16th, the coup appeared to have failed completely. It had not. Roosevelt simply spent more money. He bought a second mob. He bought more newspaper headlines. He bought the chief of police. By August 18th, Tehran was filled with men who looked spontaneously enraged, but had been recruited that morning. By the afternoon of August 19th, tanks were on the streets. The mob assaulted Mossadegh's house. He escaped through the back garden in his pajamas. Within hours, he had been arrested. Zahedi was named Prime Minister. The Shah was on a plane back to Tehran. Mossadegh was tried for treason. He defended himself for 48 hours of testimony, telling the court that his only crime had been to nationalize his country's oil. He was sentenced to 3 years in solitary confinement, then to permanent house arrest at his estate at Ahmedabad. He died there in 1967, 14 years later, never having spoken to a foreigner again. His grave was unmarked for decades because the Shah refused to allow a public memorial. The CIA called Operation Ajax a success and proceeded to use the same playbook in Guatemala the following year. For a generation of American spies, Iran would be the proof of concept that covert force was a viable substitute for diplomacy. For a generation of Iranians, it would be the proof of concept that the United States had no respect for their sovereignty whatsoever. The two perspectives sat side by side, in the same century, on the same earth, and never once spoke to each other directly until the night of November 4th, 1979. That night, a crowd of Iranian students climbed the wall of the United States Embassy in Tehran. They were prepared to occupy the building for a few days. They left 444 days later. They cited the 1953 coup as their justification. They told reporters that they were not going to allow the Americans to do to Khomeini what they had done to Mossadegh. When the embassy was searched, the documents inside were a treasure trove of names. Iranian collaborators, military contacts, intelligence assets. The students had time on their hands and patience. They sat in the rooms of the embassy and reassembled the shredded files line by line. They published the names. They executed some of the people whose names they found. They put the rest in newspapers around the world and turned the inside of an American embassy into the most damaging public archive of CIA operations ever produced. It would take the United States a generation to recover its overseas networks. Now, 26 years separate the coup of 1953 from the embassy takeover of 1979. Quite a lot happens in those 26 years. The man America put back on the throne becomes one of the wealthiest, most paranoid, and most isolated rulers in the modern world. The cleric, the Shah, deported on the day the Shah deported him, becomes a household name in every village in Iran. And the country itself becomes, depending on which day of the week you visited, the most westernized monarchy in the Middle East and the most ideologically combustible. We need to walk through that quarter century before the chickens can come home. So, let's walk through it. The Shah landed at Mehrabad Airport in Tehran on August 22nd, 1953. He had been gone exactly 1 week. He stepped off the plane, was greeted by Zahedi, and gave a speech about national unity. He would later tell biographer Margaret Lang that he had spent his exile in Rome reading detective novels and hoping for a phone call. The phone call had come. He had returned, and he intended, this time, to rule properly. He was 33 years old. He had been the King of Kings for 12 years already, technically, ever since his father had been deposed by the Allies in 1941 and shipped off to Mauritius, and then South Africa, where he died in exile. The boy king had been 21 then. He had inherited a country occupied by British and Soviet troops, a hollow throne, and a ceremonial role in a constitutional monarchy. He had spent a decade as a figurehead while elected prime ministers like Mossadegh did the actual work. Now, with Mossadegh deposed, he intended to do something different. He intended to be a king, a real one, the kind his father had been, the kind the Achaemenids had been 2,500 years before. He believed he had been chosen. He believed he had been spared. He believed that God, whatever name God might wear in his particular court, had personally intervened on August 19th, 1953, to put him back on the peacock throne. This is the first thing you have to understand about Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was not a politician. He was not even, at heart, an autocrat. He was a religious mystic with absolute power and a Swiss boarding school education. The combination was peculiar. It produced a man who could spend $1 billion on a celebration of ancient Persia, while losing the loyalty of every modern Iranian who actually had to pay for it. In 1957, 4 years into his restoration, the Shah accepted a gift from the United States. President Eisenhower, as part of his Atoms for Peace program, was offering nuclear technology to friendly nations on a non-proliferation basis. The Shah received a 5-megawatt research reactor and a cohort of Iranian physics students who were sent to study at MIT, the University of Michigan, and Berkeley. The reactor was installed at the Tehran Nuclear Research Center in 1967. At the time, this seemed like an unambiguous good. Iran was a key Cold War ally. The technology was peaceful. The students were brilliant. The program would serve as a model for what enlightened American engagement could look like. In retrospect, every centrifuge spinning at Natanz today traces back to this moment. The Iranian physics community that the United States built by hand between 1957 and 1979 did not vanish when the Shah did. The students became professors. The professors trained more students. The reactors became the basis of an indigenous program. Atoms for Peace was the seed crystal. The Iranian nuclear program, which the United States would spend 40 years trying to dismantle, was a direct technical inheritance from the United States itself. There is no version of this story in which the Americans are not, at some level, fighting their own past. The same pattern played out across other domains. The Shah's army, equipped almost entirely with American hardware, would be inherited by the Islamic Republic in 1979. The Shah's intelligence service, Savak, trained by American and Israeli specialists, would be reorganized and rebranded by the Republic, but use many of the same techniques on many of the same families. The Shah's industrial base, built by American engineers, would be nationalized but not dismantled. Almost everything America gave to a friendly Shah would, sooner or later, become the property of an unfriendly republic. The seeds did not know which kind of regime would harvest them. In 1963, the Shah announced what he called the White Revolution. It was an ambitious top-down modernization program: land redistribution, women's suffrage, literacy corps for the villages, profit sharing in industry, religious endowments brought under state control, primary education made compulsory. By Western standards, almost all of it was progressive. By any standard, it changed the country fast. The reaction came from Qom. There was a 41-year-old cleric there, a teacher of theology, who had been writing pamphlets for years. His name was Ruhollah Khomeini. He was articulate, plain-spoken, charismatic, in the way that very serious people sometimes are. He denounced the White Revolution from the pulpit. He condemned women's suffrage as a violation of Islamic law. He attacked land redistribution as theft from religious endowments. He called the Shah a puppet of foreigners. The Shah, on October 27th, 1964, signed into law a measure granting American military personnel and their dependents in Iran full diplomatic immunity from Iranian courts. They could not be arrested by Iranian police. They could not be tried by Iranian judges. They were, in effect, above Iranian law. Khomeini delivered a speech that became one of the most famous in 20th century Iran. He said that under this law, an American mechanic could run over an Ayatollah in his car and the most that could happen to the mechanic was that he would be sent home. He said that the Shah had reduced Iran to a colony. Within days, he was arrested. Within weeks, he was deported. He went first to Turkey, then to Najaf, the Shia holy city in southern Iraq. He would stay in Najaf for 13 years. He would record cassette tapes of his sermons that were smuggled into Iran in suitcases and copied on borrowed equipment in basements and played to crowds in mosques. By 1978, there were millions of these tapes circulating in Iran. They called for the Shah to be deposed. They called for an Islamic Republic. They were the soundtrack of the revolution that no one in the American embassy in Tehran was apparently listening to. In October 1971, the Shah threw a party. It was the most expensive party of the 20th century. The official cost was around $200 million in 1971 currency, well over $1 billion in current terms. The actual cost, including infrastructure improvements built specifically to host it, was likely much higher. Maxims of Paris catered. Lanvin designed the uniforms. The wines came from Bordeaux. The tents were furnished by Janssen of Paris. They served roast peacock with a pâté garnish. They served quail eggs stuffed with caviar. They served an opening cocktail of champagne, raspberry liqueur, and crushed Iranian rose petals. The location was Persepolis, the ancient ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire. The Shah was celebrating the 2500th anniversary of Cyrus the Great. He had invited every monarch and head of state in the world. 62 of them came. Haile Selassie of Ethiopia came. Imelda Marcos came. Marshal Tito came. Prince Philip and Princess Anne came. Spiro Agnew, the American vice president, came. The Pope did not come, although he sent a representative. Iranian villagers were kept 5 miles back. Television cameras were not permitted to show their faces. The official narrative was that Iran was rejoining the great civilizations of the world. The unofficial narrative, which was being recorded on cassette tapes by an exile in Najaf, was that the Shah had spent $1 billion on a party, while half of Iranian peasant women still died in childbirth. In one of his most circulated tapes, Khomeini said that the celebration was a celebration of 2,500 years of monarchy, 2,500 years of injustice. He called the participants criminals. He called the Shah a foreigner. He told Iranians that there was no bridge between them and the kind of court that ate roast peacock at the ruins of an ancient palace. The cassette tapes traveled faster than the Tehran television. On New Year's Eve, 1977, 4 years before he would be turned out of office, in part because of what was about to happen in Iran, President Jimmy Carter visited Tehran. He attended a state dinner at Niavaran Palace. He raised his glass. He looked into the cameras of the international press, and he said, in what would become one of the most ill-advised toasts in American diplomatic history, that Iran was an island of stability in one of the most troubled areas of the world. He credited the great leadership of the Shah, the love that the Iranian people had for their leader, and the personal warmth he had felt during their meetings. The Shah accepted the toast graciously. The Iranian people, who would within 12 months drive him into permanent exile, made no comment. Within 9 months of the toast, the country was in open insurrection. Throughout 1978, Demonstrations grew. Strikes paralyzed the oil sector. The army began to crack. On September 8, 1978, in Tehran's Jaleh Square, troops opened fire on a peaceful protest. Estimates of the dead range from 64 to several hundred. Iranians called it Black Friday. The Shah declared martial law. Carter, in Washington, made cautious statements. Privately, his administration was paralyzed. The State Department wanted negotiations. The National Security Council, run by Zbigniew Brzezinski, wanted a military government. The Shah himself, perhaps the most paralyzed of all, did neither. By December, the streets had become impossible. By January, the Shah had decided to take a vacation. On January 16, 1979, he and Empress Farah Diba boarded an Iran Air jet at Mehrabad Airport. He carried with him a small box of Iranian soil. He would never return. He flew first to Egypt, then to Morocco, then to the Bahamas, then to Mexico, then to the United States, where Carter agreed to admit him for cancer treatment in October. Each move would be more politically expensive than the last. On February 1st, 1979, an Air France 747 landed at Mehrabad Airport. Out walked Ruhollah Khomeini, after 14 years in exile, escorted by a French stewardess who would later say he had spent the entire flight in silent prayer. He was greeted by a crowd estimated at 6 million people. By February 11th, the army had announced its neutrality. The interim government collapsed. Khomeini's allies took control of the country. The Pahlavi dynasty had ended. The Islamic Republic had begun. The Shah, by then, was already on his way to becoming the longest-running diplomatic crisis of the late 20th century. Because he was dying, and he wanted to die in America, and Jimmy Carter was about to make a decision that would cost him his presidency. It is the morning of November 4th, 1979. A group of about 300 Iranian university students, calling themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line, gather outside the United States Embassy in Tehran. The compound is a 27-acre walled garden in the heart of the city. Inside it work 66 American diplomats, Marines, and embassy staff, plus a few visitors and dependents. Most of them are eating breakfast. The students cut the chains on the front gate at around 10:30. They climb over the walls. They are unarmed at first. The Marines, under orders not to fire on demonstrators, retreat through the building. The students take the embassy in approximately 3 hours. They handcuff the Americans. They blindfold them. They march them to the front lawn and parade them for the cameras of the foreign press, which has been alerted in advance. The students announce that they are occupying the embassy in protest of the United States government's decision 3 weeks earlier to admit the deposed Shah for cancer treatment. They say the occupation will last a few days. They say that the embassy is, as everyone outside the State Department already understands, a center of espionage that has spent 26 years undermining Iranian sovereignty. Khomeini, who has been the supreme leader for 9 months, is asked for his reaction. He could end the occupation in an hour. He has the standing. He chooses instead to bless it. He calls the embassy a den of spies. He says the students are heroes. He says the occupation is the second revolution. The occupation will not last days. It will last 444. Jimmy Carter is told about the takeover at 5:30 in the morning, Washington time. He convenes his national security team within 90 minutes. He has on the table 3 options: negotiate, sanction, strike. He cannot strike because the hostages are dispersed throughout the embassy compound, and any military action would almost certainly result in their deaths. He cannot negotiate effectively because the regime has not yet decided whether it wants to release them. He sanctions. He freezes Iranian assets in American banks, approximately $12 billion. He suspends Iranian oil imports. He tries to organize an international coalition. He waits. He is also running for re-election. The hostage crisis becomes the dominant story of every newscast. Walter Cronkite begins ending the CBS Evening News with a count of the days. 35 days held captive, 46 days, 112. The yellow ribbon ties itself around every American oak tree. The hostages' families speak nightly to reporters. The country wills its president to do something. For 5 months, Carter does nothing dramatic. Then, in April 1980, he authorizes a covert military rescue. It will be the most ambitious special operations mission in American history to that date. It will be called Operation Eagle Claw. The plan is intricate and audacious. 8 RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters will fly from the USS Nimitz in the Arabian Sea to a secret refueling site in the Iranian desert called Desert 1. There, they will meet 6 C-130 transport aircraft carrying Delta Force commandos and fuel. They will refuel, fly the commandos to a hide site near Tehran, and stage the rescue the following night. They will extract the hostages and fly them out before the Iranians can react. It will take 2 days. The mission will be deniable. Almost nothing goes right. 2 of the 8 helicopters develop mechanical problems and turn back before reaching the refueling site. A third arrives, but is grounded due to hydraulic failure. With only 5 operational helicopters, the on-scene commander, Colonel Charles Beckwith, recommends abort. The president authorizes the abort. As the aircraft prepare to leave, one of the helicopters, attempting to reposition for refueling in a sandstorm, collides with a C-130. The C-130 explodes. 8 American servicemen die in the desert. The remaining helicopters are abandoned, intact, and the surviving force is evacuated by C-130. The Iranians find the abandoned helicopters at dawn. They find the helmets and the maps and the photographs of the hostages that the rescue team had been carrying. They discover the entire plan. Khomeini, in a televised address, calls the failure a sign of God's protection. The hostages, by then, have been dispersed across multiple locations, specifically to prevent any future rescue. The political damage to Carter is unrecoverable. By the summer of 1980, his re-election campaign is in full retreat. Throughout the autumn of 1980, the Carter administration negotiated indirectly with the Iranian government for the hostages' release. By late October, sources inside the State Department believed a deal was within reach. It was not made. After Reagan won the election on November 4th, 1980, exactly 1 year after the embassy was taken, the deal accelerated. It was finalized on January 19th, 1981. The Algiers Accords. Iran would release the hostages. The United States would unfreeze approximately $8 billion in Iranian assets and pledge not to interfere in Iranian internal affairs. The hostages would be flown out of Tehran on Algerian aircraft. The hostages were released on January 20th, 1981. The exact moment of their release was, by accident or by design, the precise hour that Ronald Reagan was sworn in as the 40th President of the United States. They were held for 444 days. They were released within minutes of Carter's term ending. This timing is the basis of what is known as the October Surprise Theory. The theory holds that Reagan's campaign, through intermediaries including William Casey, who would become Reagan's CIA director, and George H.W. Bush, who would become his vice president, secretly negotiated with the Iranian regime in the autumn of 1980 to delay the hostages' release until after the election. In exchange, the Reagan administration promised arms shipments. The theory has been investigated by congressional committees, denied by participants, and partially supported by witnesses, including former Iranian officials and a former Texas lieutenant governor named Ben Barnes. Whether you believe it depends on whom you trust. What is undeniable is the timing, and the fact that within 6 months of his inauguration, Reagan's administration was secretly authorizing weapons shipments to Iran. That story, however, takes us several years ahead. We will return to it. For now, what matters is what the hostage crisis did to the United States, to Iran, and to the relationship between them. It killed Carter's presidency. The Reagan landslide of 1980 was in part a referendum on Carter's perceived weakness during the crisis. Whether Carter was actually weak is a debate for another night. What is not debatable is that the perception consumed his political career. It also remade Iranian politics. The hostage crisis was the test that confirmed Khomeini's revolutionary republic. Anyone who had questioned the wisdom of his rule, who had wanted a more pragmatic government, who had hoped for moderate Islamic reform within constitutional limits, was now silenced. The hostage-takers, including a young revolutionary named Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, became national heroes. The clerical establishment consolidated its control over the state. The provisional government, which had favored normalization with the United States, was driven from office. From November 1979 forward, the Islamic Republic was an explicitly anti-American state. It also remade the United States' approach to the Middle East. The Carter Doctrine, announced in January 1980, declared that any attempt by an outside power to gain control of the Persian Gulf region would be considered an assault on the vital interests of the United States and would be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. From that doctrine flows every American base in the Gulf, every aircraft carrier rotation, every dollar of military aid to Saudi Arabia, every meeting in Bahrain, every drone in Qatar. The hostage crisis was over by January 20th, 1981. The world it created was just beginning, and waiting at the southern border of Iran in late September 1980, while Carter was still in office, was the man who would test that world's foundations within months. His name was Saddam Hussein. He had decided that a revolutionary Iran was a weak Iran. He had decided that the United States, humiliated and embargoed, would do nothing if he invaded. He was about to find out that he was wrong about the first thing and right about the second. Saddam Hussein had been the president of Iraq for 14 months when, on September 22nd, 1980, 6 Iraqi divisions crossed the Iranian border at Khuzestan. He believed the invasion would last 6 weeks. He believed the new Iranian regime, with its purged officer corps and its disorganized revolutionary militias, would collapse on contact. He believed the United States, just 3 weeks before its presidential election and still cleaning up the wreckage of the failed hostage rescue, would either help him or stay out of his way. He was wrong about the first prediction by approximately 2,000%. The war would last not 6 weeks, but 8 years. By its end, between 500,000 and 1 million Iranians would be dead, including a generation of teenage volunteers, the Basij, who marched through minefields holding plastic keys to paradise that Khomeini had distributed by the millions. Iraq would lose perhaps half as many. 3 million people on both sides would be wounded. Both economies would be eviscerated, and the war would freeze the political energy of both societies in place for a generation. He was right about the second prediction. The United States, after a brief period of formal neutrality, took Iraq's side. By 1982, the Reagan administration had removed Iraq from the State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism. By 1983, Donald Rumsfeld, in his capacity as Reagan's special envoy to the Middle East, was sitting across from Saddam Hussein in Baghdad, shaking his hand for the cameras. Reagan provided Iraq with intelligence, with chemical warfare precursors that Iraq was already using against Iranian forces and Iraqi Kurds, and with billions of dollars in agricultural credits. The United States knew about the chemical attacks. It chose to look away. This is the part of the 80s most Americans do not remember. The United States actively supported the Iraqi war effort against Iran. It justified this on the grounds of the Carter Doctrine. A revolutionary Iran in regional control was unacceptable. A weakened Iran fighting a long war was strategically tolerable. Whatever Saddam was doing on the battlefield, he was doing it to a country that had taken Americans hostage and continued to call the United States the Great Satan. The math, in the Reagan administration's view, was straightforward. It was not, however, the only thing the Reagan administration was doing in those years. There was a parallel program, and it ran in the opposite direction. By 1984, Iran and Iraq were attacking each other's oil exports. Iraq attacked Iranian tankers. Iran attacked tankers carrying Iraqi or Kuwaiti oil. The Persian Gulf, the world's most strategically important waterway, became a shooting gallery. About 400 ships were attacked over the course of the war. Roughly 400 sailors, mostly civilians, were killed. The United States Navy, in 1987, agreed to escort Kuwaiti oil tankers reflagged under American colors. The operation was called Earnest Will. It was the largest American naval convoy operation since the Second World War. American sailors and Iranian Revolutionary Guard speedboats began encountering each other in the Strait of Hormuz on a near-daily basis. In April 1988, an Iranian mine struck the USS Samuel B. Roberts, a Perry-class frigate. The ship survived, but was severely damaged. The United States retaliated 4 days later in Operation Praying Mantis, the largest American naval engagement since the Second World War. 2 Iranian frigates were sunk. Several other Iranian boats were destroyed. Iran's navy was effectively neutralized in a single afternoon. The tanker war established the precedent that the United States would treat any threat to Persian Gulf shipping as an attack on its own interests. That precedent has shaped every subsequent American military deployment to the region, every aircraft carrier rotation, every minesweeper, every base in Bahrain or the UAE or Qatar traces back to the lessons of 1987 and 1988. But while the Navy was protecting Kuwaiti oil from Iranian attack in the Persian Gulf, something quite different was happening in the basement of the old Executive Office building in Washington. The Reagan administration was selling weapons to Iran and using the profits to fund a Central American war that Congress had explicitly forbidden it from funding. The story is so absurd that you have to remind yourself it is real. In May 1986, 3 Americans flew to Tehran on a private aircraft. They were carrying a Bible signed by Ronald Reagan, a kosher chocolate cake, and a plane load of TOW anti-tank missiles and Hawk surface-to-air missiles. The men were Robert McFarlane, Reagan's former national security advisor, Oliver North, a Marine lieutenant colonel on the National Security Council staff, and George Cave, a retired CIA officer with deep Iran experience. The plan, in summary, was this. Iran needed weapons, especially anti-aircraft missiles, to defend against Iraqi air attacks. The United States had spent 5 years declaring Iran a state sponsor of terrorism and forbidding all weapons sales. But Iran had influence over Hezbollah in Lebanon, which was holding several American hostages. The Reagan administration believed that if it sold Iran the missiles, indirectly through Israel, Iran would lean on Hezbollah to release the hostages. The first weapons shipments occurred in 1985. American hostages were released. New hostages were taken. More weapons were shipped. Reagan, in an interview, denied that he was trading arms for hostages. The denial would not survive contact with the documents. Oliver North, in his role on the National Security Council, took the operation a step further. The proceeds from the arms sales to Iran were laundered through a Swiss bank account and used to fund the Contras, the right-wing rebels in Nicaragua fighting the Sandinista government. Congress had passed the Boland Amendment, which explicitly prohibited the United States government from funding the Contras. North and his colleagues had simply created a shadow government to do what the actual government was prohibited from doing. The whole arrangement was discovered, more or less by accident, in October 1986. A Lebanese magazine called Shah reported the McFarlane delegation. A C-123 transport plane was shot down over Nicaragua, and the crew was found to be working for North's operation. The thread, once pulled, unspooled the entire scheme. Iran-Contra was the largest American executive branch scandal since Watergate. It occupied the country for 2 years. The Tower Commission concluded that Reagan had been negligent. The independent counsel, Lawrence Walsh, charged 14 administration officials. 11 were convicted. Several were pardoned by the elder Bush before they could serve their sentences, and the rest had their convictions vacated on technicalities. Oliver North, in 7 days of riveting televised testimony in July 1987, became briefly a folk hero of the American right and a permanent reference point in American political comedy. He sat in the witness chair in his marine dress uniform, his chest gleaming with medals, and explained, with apparent sincerity, that he had shredded documents and lied to Congress in service of his country. The country, depending on which half you talked to, either applauded or recoiled. Reagan addressed the nation in March 1987 and said that, while his heart told him the arms for hostages story was untrue, the facts told him otherwise. It was the closest a sitting American president had come to admitting having lied since Nixon. He did not resign. The Cold War was still on. The American public by then was tired of the story. Reagan's 2 terms ended in 1989. He left office with high popularity ratings. The Iran-Contra scandal, the tilt to Iraq, the chemical weapons cover-up, the hostage releases that produced more hostages, and the secret arms shipments to a regime he publicly called terrorists. All of it faded from the front page within a presidential election cycle. Reagan, on his deathbed, was widely remembered as the man who had won the Cold War, not the man who had run the most legally aggressive covert operation against Congress in modern American history. Iran took different lessons. Iran learned, first, that the United States could simultaneously support its enemy and sell it weapons, and feel no contradiction. Iran learned, second, that hostage-taking was a useful instrument of policy because the United States would pay for the release of its citizens with weapons and unfrozen assets. Iran learned, third, that there was no domestic American political constituency that cared about civilian casualties in Iranian villages, in Iraqi battlefields, or in the Persian Gulf, so long as the oil kept flowing. These lessons would shape the next 40 years of Iranian strategy. Hezbollah, founded in 1982, became the model for every subsequent Iranian proxy. The Quds Force, established in 1990 and led from 1998 by Qasem Soleimani, became the foreign operations arm that managed every proxy network. The doctrine, articulated by Khomeini's successor, Ali Khamenei, was simple. Never fight America directly. Always make America's allies and proxies pay the price. Drag every conflict out for years. Make American casualties politically intolerable. But before any of that doctrine could be tested in places like Lebanon and Yemen, the Reagan administration would face one final, accidental confrontation with Iran. It would happen on the morning of July 3rd, 1988. It would involve a missile cruiser, a passenger plane, and 290 dead civilians. It would be the moment Iran learned, with absolute clarity, exactly what it could expect from the United States in a moral emergency. The USS Vincennes was a Ticonderoga-class missile cruiser commissioned in 1985. She was equipped with the Aegis Combat System, the most advanced naval radar and anti-aircraft management package in the world. She was commanded in the summer of 1988 by Captain William Rogers III, a 50-year-old officer with a reputation among his fellow captains for aggressiveness. Some of them, off the record, used the word reckless. The ship's nickname in the fleet by mid-1988 was Robo-Cruiser. On the morning of July 3rd, 1988, the Vincennes was operating in the Strait of Hormuz, near the Iranian island of Keshm. She was engaged in a small boat skirmish with Iranian Revolutionary Guard speedboats. The fighting was at close range and chaotic. A second American warship, the USS Sides, was nearby and operating under the same operational picture. The Sides also had Aegis. The Sides also had the same radar feeds. At 10:17 in the morning, Tehran time, an Iran Air Airbus A300 took off from Bandar Abbas International Airport. Its destination was Dubai. It was Iran Air Flight 655. Its scheduled flight time was less than 30 minutes. There were 290 people aboard. 274 of them were Iranian citizens. 66 of them were children. The Vientiane's radar acquired the aircraft within 60 seconds of takeoff. The Vientiane's Combat Information Center misidentified the contact almost immediately. They thought it was an F-14 fighter. The F-14 in question was an Iranian aircraft. The Iranian Air Force did fly F-14s. The Vientiane's, in the heat of the surface engagement and in a state of escalating tension, locked on. Captain Rogers issued a series of radio warnings on the wrong frequencies. The pilot of Flight 655 did not hear them. The pilot was in the climb-out portion of his flight plan. He was on the international civilian air corridor. He was squawking civilian transponder codes. At 10:24 a.m., Captain Rogers ordered the launch of 2 SM-2 Standard surface-to-air missiles. The first one hit the Airbus over the Gulf, 15 miles south of Bandar Abbas, at 14,000 feet. The aircraft broke apart. Bodies fell into the water. For several minutes, 290 souls. A pilgrim returning from his Hajj. A bride traveling to her wedding. 66 children. An Iranian poet. A father with his daughter on his lap. A doctor. 2 newlyweds. A teacher with her class on a school trip. The names of all of them were published in Iranian newspapers in the days that followed. Their faces filled the front page of every paper for weeks. Their funerals filled Tehran. Their portraits hung from every overpass. Iran did not move on. Iran has never moved on. The Iranian government's first response was rage. Khomeini, in a televised address that night, called the strike a calculated act of murder. He said that the United States had committed an atrocity that no Muslim could ever forget. He vowed revenge against the American government. The Iranian Foreign Ministry filed a formal complaint with the United Nations Security Council. The United Nations declined to condemn the United States. The vote was 9 in favor of a resolution, noting deep regret. There were no votes against. There was no apology. The American government's first response was a press conference at the Pentagon. Vice Admiral William Crowe, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that the Vincennes had acted in self-defense. He claimed, incorrectly, that the aircraft had been descending toward the Vincennes. He claimed, incorrectly, that the aircraft had been outside the civilian air corridor. He claimed, incorrectly, that the aircraft had failed to respond to radio warnings. Each of these claims was either false or unverifiable at the time it was made. None of them was retracted in any public way for years. George H.W. Bush, who was at the time the vice president and the front-runner for the Republican presidential nomination, was asked at a campaign event whether the United States would apologize. He looked at the reporter. He paused. He said, In a phrase that would be played back in Iran for the next 37 years, I will never apologize for the United States of America. I don't care what the facts are. Within a year, the Vincennes Captain Rogers had received the Legion of Merit, an award commonly given to commanders for exceptionally meritorious conduct in performance of outstanding services. The citation made no specific mention of the events of July 3rd. The decoration was awarded for his entire 18-month tour of duty in the Persian Gulf. The award provoked no public American outrage. It provoked considerable Iranian outrage. In 1996, 8 years after the strike, the United States agreed to pay Iran $61 million in compensation for the deaths of the Iranian victims. The settlement was made through the International Court of Justice. The United States did not admit fault. The phrase used in American government communications was ex gratia, as an act of grace, not as an admission of wrongdoing. If you ask an average Iranian on the street today what Iran Air 655 was, they will tell you immediately. If you ask an average American the same question, you will get a blank stare. This asymmetry is the entire problem. Iran built a bronze monument in Bandar Abbas. The names of all 290 dead are engraved on it. School children visit it. Politicians lay wreaths there. The anniversary is observed every year. The Vincennes incident is taught in Iranian primary schools. It is part of every Iranian's cognitive furniture. When the Iranian government argues, in 2025, that the United States cannot be trusted, this is one of the data points it cites. It cites the same date every year. July 3rd. The United States did not memorialize the dead. The United States did not apologize. The United States did not punish the captain. The United States, in the press, treated the entire incident as one of those unfortunate things that happens in war zones. It did not know that it had handed the Iranian regime a propaganda gift that would still be active 40 years later. It did not know, in 1988, that it had handed the Iranian Revolutionary Guard a recruiting tool. It did not know that the words, "I will never apologize for the United States of America. I don't care what the facts are," would be played in Tehran on the anniversary of July 3rd every year, in perpetuity. This is what we mean when we say that the asymmetry of memory is the asymmetry of the relationship. One side carries the names. The other has forgotten the date. We will leave the 80s here. The decade ends with George H.W. Bush in the White House, with the Iran-Iraq War concluded by exhaustion in August 1988, with the Cold War ending, and with both the United States and Iran exhausted and locked into postures of grievance. The next chapter would begin with a new Iranian president who wanted, for a brief and luminous moment, to do something different. His name was Mohammad Khatami. He spoke quietly. He spoke about civilizations talking to each other, and nobody in Washington, until it was already too late, was listening. Mohammad Khatami won the Iranian presidency in May 1997 by a landslide. He received nearly 70% of the vote. He defeated the conservative establishment candidate. He was a cleric, the son of a cleric, but he had been the head of the National Library and a deputy minister of culture. He spoke softly. He smiled often. He wore a black turban and a brown robe, and he gave press conferences in fluent German. Khatami's signature foreign policy idea was something he called the dialogue of civilizations. The phrase was a deliberate counter to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis, which had been published in Foreign Affairs in 1993. Khatami, in a famous CNN interview with Christiane Amanpour in January 1998, looked directly into the camera and addressed the American people. He said he respected America's great civilization. He said the regrettable history between the two peoples could be set aside. He said it was time, in his words, to crack the wall of mistrust that had been built up over decades. This was, by any measure, an extraordinary moment. An Iranian president had not addressed the American people directly since 1979. Khatami's words were calibrated, repeatable, and almost embarrassingly hopeful. He used the word civilization rather than the word state. He used the word dialogue rather than the word negotiation. He invited cultural exchange. He proposed academic visits. He explicitly endorsed the resolution of the dispute over Hezbollah and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through international consensus rather than violence. In Washington, the response was cautious. The Clinton administration was internally divided. Some senior officials, including Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, were intrigued. Albright would, in March 2000, deliver a public speech in which she acknowledged American responsibility for the 1953 coup. It was the first time any senior American official had publicly acknowledged the coup at all. She called it a setback for democracy in Iran. She said the United States understood why the Iranian people felt the way they did. She apologized. It was a remarkable speech. It was also too late. Khatami's domestic position was already weakening. The conservative establishment in Tehran, threatened by his popularity, was pushing back hard. Newspapers were being closed, reformist activists were being jailed, and in Washington, the Clinton administration was preoccupied with impeachment, the dot-com bubble, and Yugoslavia. The window opened, then it closed. On September 11th, 2001, nearly 3,000 Americans were killed in coordinated terrorist attacks. The attacks were planned by Al-Qaeda, a Sunni jihadist organization based in Afghanistan, ideologically opposed to Shia Iran. Within hours of the attacks, candlelight vigils in Tehran honored the American dead. Ordinary Iranians, despite 40 years of state hostility, expressed sympathy. The Iranian government, through diplomatic channels, offered cooperation against Al-Qaeda. That cooperation was real and substantial. In the months after 9/11, Iranian intelligence services provided the United States with the names and locations of Al-Qaeda operatives who had fled to Iran from Afghanistan. They detained dozens of Al-Qaeda fighters, including senior figures. They allowed American search and rescue aircraft to overfly Iranian territory during the invasion of Afghanistan. They participated, through diplomatic intermediaries, in the December 2001 Bonn Conference that established the post-Taliban Afghan government. The Iranian delegation, led by Mohammad Javad Zarif, played a constructive role. Several American officials at the conference, including the State Department's Iran specialists, came home with the impression that the door was open. Then came January 29th, 2002. President George W. Bush stood before a joint session of Congress and delivered the State of the Union address. It was the first State of the Union since 9/11. The speech had been drafted by David Frum and Michael Gerson. The phrase that would echo for the next 20 years was Frum's. It was lifted, with slight modification, from a phrase he had drafted to describe Iraq alone. Then the speechwriting team had decided, for rhetorical balance, to add two other countries. The phrase was axis of evil. The countries were Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. The phrase landed in Tehran like a missile. Khatami had spent 5 years building the case, against very real domestic resistance, that engagement with the United States was possible. He had cooperated against al-Qaeda. He had endorsed dialogue. He had given his most gifted diplomats license to work directly with American counterparts. And, in one 20-second sentence, an American president had grouped Iran with Iraq and North Korea, two states with which the United States was about to be at war, or actively considering war. The speech, by all accounts, was a turning point. It destroyed Khatami's reform agenda. The Iranian moderates were humiliated. The conservatives were vindicated. The argument that no good could come of cooperating with the Americans, an argument the conservatives had been making for years, was suddenly the consensus position. Within weeks, the Iranian government withdrew from cooperation on al-Qaeda matters. Within months, Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers who had been quietly cooperating with American intelligence on Afghanistan were reassigned to projects designed to make American life in the region miserable. The 2002 speech also launched something else. In the spring of 2003, the United States invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein. In the immediate aftermath, the Iranian government, through a Swiss intermediary, sent Washington what is now known as the Grand Bargain Memo. The memo proposed a comprehensive resolution of all outstanding issues between the two countries. It included Iranian recognition of Israel, full transparency on the nuclear program, an end to support for terrorism, and a cessation of activity in Iraq. In return, Iran asked for an end to sanctions, security guarantees, and recognition. The Bush administration did not respond. Officials including Vice President Cheney and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld were dismissive. They believed that Iran, with Saddam gone and an American army in Iraq, would soon be on its knees and could be dictated to. They believed wrong. In June 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a former Tehran mayor, a member of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, a Holocaust denier, and an outspoken hardliner, won the Iranian presidential election. He campaigned on populism, anti-corruption, and resistance to Western pressure. He won partly because of disillusionment with Khatami's failure to deliver economic improvement, partly because of the conservative backlash to the axis of evil speech, partly because of the conservative establishment's manipulation of the election machinery. Ahmadinejad's foreign policy was, in essence, the opposite of Khatami's. He gave inflammatory speeches at the United Nations General Assembly. He denied the Holocaust. He called for the destruction of Israel. He accelerated Iran's nuclear program. He cracked down on domestic dissent. In 2009, when the regime stole his re-election from a more moderate challenger named Mir Hossein Mousavi, the Green Movement took to the streets. Millions of Iranians, mostly young, mostly urban, demonstrated for weeks. They were beaten, imprisoned, killed. Neda Aga Sultan, a 26-year-old graduate student, was shot in the chest by a Basij paramilitary on a Tehran street. The video of her death, captured on a cell phone, went viral. The Obama administration, which had taken office that January with hopes of engagement, made cautious statements about non-interference. It would be criticized for years afterward for not having backed the protesters more forcefully. It would also have been criticized for years if it had backed them more forcefully and helped the regime paint them as American agents. There was no good answer. There rarely is. By the time Ahmadinejad's second term ended in 2013, the window Khatami had opened was sealed shut. Iran's nuclear program had advanced from 20 centrifuges to 19,000. Sanctions had crippled the Iranian economy. The Iranian middle class was angry, exhausted, and politically homeless. The Revolutionary Guard had become the dominant economic force in the country. And in the basements of the Pentagon and the White House, an entirely new kind of weapon was being prepared. It was code. It would travel by USB drive. It would not have a name until German researchers found it on Iranian computers and gave it one. They called it Stuxnet, the first true cyber weapon in history, and it was about to make Iranian centrifuges destroy themselves. "230 meters underground, beneath the Iranian desert, in a facility named for the nearest small town of Natanz, sit thousands of gas centrifuges. They are tall, narrow, vertical machines, each about 6 feet high, each spinning at 50,000 revolutions per minute. They are arranged in rows called cascades. Each cascade processes uranium hexafluoride gas, slowly, patiently, enriching the proportion of the U-235 isotope. At 3% enrichment, the uranium is fuel for civilian power reactors. At 20%, it is medical grade. At 90%, it is weapons grade. The mathematics of enrichment are not linear. By the time you have enriched uranium to 20%, you have done about 90% of the work needed to enrich it to 90%. This is the part of the Iranian nuclear program that haunted 4 American presidents. The civilian justifications, the medical isotope arguments, the energy independence rhetoric. All of it was technically true, but operationally beside the point. Once you have enriched uranium past 20%, the time to a bomb is measured in weeks, not years. Natanz by 2009 was approaching that threshold. The Iranian engineering had been impressive. The Iranians had built the facility underground in a hardened bunker after Israel had destroyed Saddam Hussein's Osirak reactor in 1981, and after the United States had begun openly threatening preemptive strikes. The Natanz facility was designed to survive a conventional bombing campaign. The Iranian centrifuges, originally based on stolen designs from the Pakistani scientist Aqi Khan, had been refined into a domestic product line. The centrifuges spun, the cascades enriched, the clock ticked. Israel, by 2008, had concluded that it would have to take military action to stop the program. The Israeli military had begun training for a strike. The Israeli Air Force had begun rehearsing very long-range missions. Israeli officials were briefing American counterparts that they could not wait much longer. The Bush administration, in its final months, did not want a Middle Eastern war. Neither did the incoming Obama administration. Both of them needed something else. Something that could buy time. The plan, in retrospect, was extraordinarily ambitious. The United States, working with Israel, would develop a piece of malicious software that could find its way onto the industrial control systems at Natanz, even though those systems were air-gapped, meaning they were not connected to the internet at all. The software would, once inside, identify itself to the specific Siemens controllers operating the centrifuges. It would issue commands that would cause the centrifuges to spin at speeds dangerously above their design parameters, while reporting back to the operators that everything was normal. The centrifuges would tear themselves apart. The operators would believe they were dealing with random equipment failures, low-quality manufacturing, sabotage by their own technicians. They would, with luck, never realize what was happening. The development was a joint operation between the National Security Agency and Israel's Unit 8200. It was codenamed Olympic Games. The malware that resulted was extraordinarily complex. It contained 4 different zero-day exploits, vulnerabilities in widely used software that the manufacturers did not know about. Each 0 day was on its own worth perhaps $1 million on the black market. The code was tens of thousands of lines long. It was designed to ignore any computer that was not running the specific Siemens controllers used at Natanz. It was designed to delete itself if certain conditions were met. It was the most sophisticated piece of malware in history at the time it was deployed. It was delivered, almost certainly, by USB drive, carried into the Natanz facility by a contractor or a technician who did not know what they were carrying. The first deployment was in 2009. The early effects were modest. Centrifuges began to fail at a higher than expected rate. Iranian engineers, frustrated, replaced them. They blamed Pakistani manufacturing. They blamed humid air. They blamed quality control failures by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's procurement teams. They did not blame software because they had no reason to imagine that software was the problem. The pace accelerated through 2010. By the spring of that year, the centrifuges at Natanz were failing in groups of 1 and 2 and 5 and 10 and 20. Iranian production fell behind. The clock that had been ticking toward a bomb began to tick more slowly. Israel began to back off its threats of imminent military action. The Obama administration began to feel that it had bought enough time for diplomacy to work, although it did not yet know what diplomacy that might be. Then, in June 2010, a Belarusian antivirus researcher named Sergei Ulasen found something strange on a customer's computer. A piece of code that did not match any known signature. Ulasen sent the sample to Symantec, the American antivirus company. Symantec's engineers spent months reverse engineering the code. They eventually concluded that what they had found was not a typical piece of malware, but a state-grade weapon. The code was so specific to Siemens controllers that it had to have been developed by people who knew exactly what hardware they wanted to attack. The code was so sophisticated that it had to have been developed with the resources of a major intelligence service. The code was, the Symantec analysts wrote in a public report, almost certainly the first cyberweapon ever deployed in war. The discovery of Stuxnet had 2 consequences. First, it confirmed publicly, for the first time, what intelligence services around the world had long suspected. The United States and Israel had been conducting a covert sabotage program against Iran's nuclear facilities. The American government did not officially confirm Stuxnet for years. American officials, off the record, took credit for it. President Obama, in his memoirs, described the operation in detail. The cat was out of the bag. Second, it convinced every other state in the world that cyberweapons were now part of the strategic landscape. Russia, China, North Korea, France, the United Kingdom, Iran itself, all accelerated their cyberweapon programs. Iran, in particular, used Stuxnet as the model for its own cyber capabilities. By 2012, Iran had developed enough offensive cyber capability to wipe the hard drives of 30,000 computers at the Saudi state oil company, Saudi Aramco. By 2014, Iran had hacked the Sands Casino in Las Vegas in retaliation for the owner's pro-Israel statements. By 2018, Iran had conducted cyber operations against American banks, American utilities, and American voter registration databases. The cyber genie was out of the bottle. The United States had let it out. But Stuxnet had also done something more important. It had bought time. By 2013, with the Iranian centrifuge program crippled, with new sanctions strangling the Iranian economy, with the new Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani, signaling openness to dialogue, the conditions were right for what would become the most ambitious diplomatic agreement of the Obama era. It would take 3 years of negotiation. It would involve 5 other major powers. It would impose the most intrusive nuclear inspection regime in history, and it would survive less than half of one American presidential election cycle before being torn up. This is the story of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The deal, the breakthrough, and the man who ripped it up. Hassan Rouhani won the 2013 Iranian presidential election as a moderate. He was a cleric, a former nuclear negotiator, fluent in English, French, and German, with a doctorate from Glasgow Caledonian University. He campaigned on a single overriding promise. He would relieve the sanctions that had crippled the Iranian economy. He won by a clear margin in the first round. His foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, was a career diplomat, American-educated, fluent in idiomatic English, almost familiar to American audiences from his appearances on Sunday talk shows. The two men were given a mandate by Supreme Leader Khamenei. They had license to negotiate with the West, but only on the nuclear file. Other issues, including Iran's regional behavior and missile program, were off-limits. The negotiations took place primarily in Vienna, with intervals in Geneva, Lausanne, and Muscat. They ran from late 2013 through July 2015. They involved the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, plus Germany, plus Iran. The American side was led first by Secretary of State John Kerry, with Wendy Sherman as the lead negotiator and Ernest Moniz as the technical lead. The technical complexity was extraordinary. The agreement would have to specify exact numbers of centrifuges by type, exact storage requirements for enriched uranium, exact verification procedures, exact timelines for sunset clauses, exact circumstances under which sanctions would snap back. The negotiations broke down dozens of times. They were resumed dozens of times. Both sides, by mid-2015, were exhausted. Several near collapses are remembered. In November 2013, the parties reached an interim agreement, the Joint Plan of Action. In April 2015, after a marathon, 13-day session in Lausanne, they reached a framework agreement. In July 2015, after 17 consecutive days of negotiation in Vienna, they reached the final text. On July 14, 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was announced in Vienna. Foreign Minister Zarif called it a win-win for both sides. Secretary Kerry, exhausted but smiling, delivered a press conference in which he praised the resilience of his Iranian counterpart. President Obama, in a joint Rose Garden statement, called the deal historic. He said that the alternative was war, and the alternative was unacceptable. The terms were specific and elaborate. Iran would reduce its stockpile of low-enriched uranium by 98%. It would limit its enrichment capacity at Natanz to roughly 5,000 first-generation centrifuges. It would convert its underground facility at Fordow from an enrichment plant to a research center. It would dismantle its heavy water reactor at Arak and reconfigure it to produce less plutonium. It would accept the most intrusive inspection regime in nuclear history, granting the International Atomic Energy Agency continuous access to all enrichment facilities and uranium mines and storage sites. In exchange, the United States and the European Union and the United Nations would lift the sanctions related to the nuclear program. Approximately $100 billion in frozen Iranian assets would be released. Iran would be allowed to return to the international banking system. International oil companies would be allowed to invest in Iran's petroleum sector. The European aerospace industry would be allowed to sell aircraft to Iran Air. The Iranian economy, which had contracted by approximately 20% over 5 years of sanctions, was supposed to begin recovering. The deal was not a treaty. It was an executive agreement. It did not require Senate ratification, which it would not have received. It did, however, withstand a Senate disapproval vote. 42 senators, more than the 34 required to sustain a presidential veto, supported it. The deal entered into force on January 16, 2016, when the IAEA certified Iran's compliance. The frozen assets were released. The sanctions were lifted. For approximately 2 years, the JCPOA functioned. The IAEA reported that Iran was complying with all technical obligations. The Iranian economy began to recover. Iran Air ordered new Boeing 737s and Airbus A320s. The international companies began to return. Then, Donald Trump won the 2016 American presidential election. Trump had campaigned against the JCPOA. He called it the worst deal ever negotiated. He promised to tear it up on his first day in office. He did not. For 16 months, despite intense pressure from his Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, his Secretary of Defense James Mattis, and his National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, all of whom counseled retention, Trump certified Iranian compliance with the agreement. In April 2018, Tillerson and McMaster were both gone. Mike Pompeo had replaced Tillerson. John Bolton, an outspoken JCPOA critic, had replaced McMaster. The internal balance had shifted decisively against the agreement. On May 8, 2018, in the diplomatic reception room of the White House, Trump signed a presidential memorandum withdrawing the United States from the JCPOA. He cited Iran's regional behavior, its missile program, and the sunset clauses in the agreement. He promised that the United States would impose maximum pressure sanctions until Iran agreed to a better deal. The IAEA, at the time of the withdrawal, was certifying that Iran was in full compliance with the JCPOA's technical terms. The European parties to the agreement, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and the European Union, expressed dismay and stated that they would attempt to keep the agreement alive without the United States. They could not. The American sanctions were extraterritorial. Any European company that did business with Iran would be blocked from the American market. The European companies, faced with a choice between Iran and the United States, chose the United States. By the end of 2018, the JCPOA was effectively dead. Iran was being squeezed by sanctions almost as severe as those that had brought it to the table in the first place. Trump's maximum pressure campaign aimed to bring the Iranian economy to its knees and force the regime back to the negotiating table on terms more favorable to the United States. The State Department issued a list of 12 demands. Iran was to abandon all enrichment, dismantle its missile program, end support for Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis, and accept a series of other demands that, in their entirety, amounted to capitulation. The Iranian regime did not capitulate. It did the opposite. It accelerated its nuclear program in graduated steps. It increased the level of enrichment from 3.67% to 20%, and then to 60%, edging closer to weapons grade. It deployed more advanced centrifuges. It expanded its operations at Fordow. By 2024, it would have, according to the IAEA, enough enriched uranium for several nuclear weapons, although it had not, as of that point, weaponized any of it. The maximum pressure campaign also produced a series of dangerous incidents in the Persian Gulf and the wider region. Iran began seizing tankers. The United States increased its naval presence. There were attacks on oil storage facilities in Saudi Arabia, attributed to Iran or its proxies. There were attacks on American positions in Iraq. There were drone strikes and counterstrikes. The risk of war throughout 2019 was higher than at any time since the early 1980s. By December of 2019, the Trump administration had decided to demonstrate that maximum pressure had a kinetic dimension. Iran, in their view, was testing the limits. The administration wanted to set a new ceiling. The man chosen as the message was the man we met at the beginning of this video, Qasem Soleimani. We return now to the night we began with, January 3rd, 2020, 12:47 in the morning. Two black sedans pulling off the access road of Baghdad International Airport. You now know what was on the line. You know that Soleimani had spent 22 years building the Quds Force into the most effective foreign operations arm of any modern revolutionary state. You know that he had personally directed the strategy that had used Hezbollah to drive American Marines out of Beirut in 1983, after a truck bomb killed 241 of them. You know he had built the network that supplied Iraqi militias with the explosively formed penetrators that killed approximately 600 American soldiers between 2003 and 2011. You know he had directed Iranian support to Bashar al-Assad in Syria, helping to keep that regime in power through a civil war that killed 500,000 Syrians and produced 6 million refugees. You know he had directed support to the Houthis in Yemen, who fired Iranian-supplied missiles at Saudi oil facilities and at Israeli cities. You know he had been the most dangerous and effective American adversary in the entire Middle East. You also know that he had been allowed to operate freely. Multiple American administrations had had opportunities to kill him. Multiple American administrations had decided, for various reasons, that the cost of doing so exceeded the benefit. He had grown so confident in his immunity that he traveled openly. He flew commercial. He used named convoys. He met openly with Iraqi officials and militia commanders. He believed that the Americans would not dare. He believed wrong. The Hellfires hit at 12:48 a.m. Local Iraqi authorities recovered remains from 2 destroyed sedans. They identified Soleimani by the unique signet ring he wore on his right hand. The strike was officially announced by the Pentagon at 3:45 a.m. local time. 4 hours after impact, Iran's response was immediate and complex. Within 72 hours, Iranian Revolutionary Guard ballistic missiles struck Al-Assad and Erbil air bases in Iraq. American forces had received advance warning, evacuated to bunkers, and survived without fatalities. Although approximately 100 American service members were diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries. Iran, anticipating American retaliation, placed its air defenses on highest alert. On the morning of January 8th, with its air defense crews exhausted and on edge, an Iranian crew at Imam Khomeini International Airport mistook a Ukrainian International Airlines passenger plane for an American cruise missile. They fired 2 surface-to-air missiles. The plane disintegrated over Tehran. All 176 people aboard were killed, including 57 Canadians and many Iranian Canadians. The Iranian government denied responsibility for 3 days. Then, international forensic evidence forced an admission. The Revolutionary Guard apologized. Tehran's streets briefly filled with grieving civilians. Then the world locked itself indoors with a virus, and the moment passed. The pandemic was particularly cruel to Iran. The country had one of the world's first major outbreaks outside of China in February 2020 in the holy city of Qom. By March, hospital systems were overwhelmed. By April, deaths were among the highest per capita in the world. By summer, the Iranian economy, already crippled by sanctions, was effectively non-functional outside of essential services and oil exports. The pandemic also stripped away a great deal of the regime's political legitimacy. The official death toll was a fraction of the actual death toll. Hospitals refused to accept patients because they had no equipment. Vaccines were politically contested. The Supreme Leader denounced American and British vaccines as unreliable. The result was that Iranians who had access to friends and family in Europe and North America imported their own vaccines, while ordinary Iranians waited months for inferior Russian or Chinese alternatives. By late 2020, there were street protests over economic conditions. They were small, but persistent. The regime, distracted by the pandemic, was less effective at suppressing them than it had been with the Green Movement of 2009 or the gas price protests of late 2019. in which around 1,500 Iranians had been killed by security forces in the space of 2 weeks. The Biden administration, which took office in January 2021, attempted to revive the JCPOA. Indirect negotiations resumed in Vienna throughout 2021 and 2022. The Iranian negotiating position hardened. Ebrahim Raisi, a hardline cleric and former judiciary chief responsible for thousands of executions during the 1980s, won the 2021 Iranian presidential election. His foreign policy was more conservative than Rouhani's. The window narrowed. By mid-2022, the negotiations had stalled. On September 13, 2022, a 22-year-old Iranian Kurdish woman named Mahsa Amini was arrested by the morality police on the streets of Tehran. She was visiting from her home in Saqqez, in the Iranian province of Kurdistan. The morality police are the unit responsible for enforcing Iran's mandatory hijab law. They believed her hijab was improperly worn. They placed her in custody. She was taken to a detention center in Tehran. There, according to multiple witnesses, she was beaten. She fell into a coma. 3 days later, on September 16, 2022, she was pronounced dead. The protests began the next day at her funeral in Saqqez. They spread to Tehran within 24 hours. They spread to every major city in Iran within 72 hours. They were led, almost entirely, by young women. They were called the Woman, Life, Freedom Movement, after a Kurdish slogan adopted by the protesters. The protests were sustained for more than 4 months. Hundreds of demonstrators were killed. Tens of thousands were arrested. Several were executed by hanging in public squares. The regime survived, as it always has, by force. But something had changed. The Mahsa Amini protests revealed, in a way nothing had since 1979, that an entire generation of Iranians, the young, urban, educated generation born after the Iran-Iraq War, no longer accepted the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic. They did not just protest the hijab law, they protested the regime as a whole. They tore down portraits of the Supreme Leader. They burned police stations. They chanted death to the dictator. They were the children of the Green Movement, grown up. The international response was significant, but limited. Sanctions were tightened. The European Union withdrew Iranian officials' privileges. The United Nations established a fact-finding mission. The Iranian regime was, for the first time since 2003, almost universally isolated. Almost. China and Russia did not join the condemnation. Russia, in particular, was buying Iranian drones for use against Ukraine. The relationship between Tehran and Moscow had reached an unprecedented depth. For 71 years, the United States and Iran had not exchanged direct fire. They had fought through proxies. They had assassinated each other's officials. They had attacked each other's economies. They had not bombed each other's territory. On April 13, 2024, that pattern broke. Iran launched approximately 300 drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles at Israel. The attack was massive, openly announced, and televised. It was Iran's first direct attack on Israeli territory in the history of the Islamic Republic. It was also, given that the United States Air Force participated extensively in shooting the missiles down, the first direct kinetic exchange between American military forces and Iranian military forces since the Tanker War of 1988. The provocation, in Iran's view, had been an Israeli airstrike on the Iranian consular annex in Damascus on April 1st, 2024, that killed 7 Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers, including a senior Quds Force commander. The Iranian government argued that, since a diplomatic facility was sovereign Iranian territory, the strike was an attack on Iran proper. The Iranian government also argued that after years of Israeli assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists and Quds Force officers, the strike crossed a red line. The Israeli response was an airstrike on April 19, 2024, on an air defense radar system near Isfahan, the location of one of Iran's most important nuclear research facilities. The strike was small. It was symbolic. It was a message. By late 2024, exchanges had become semi-routine. By early 2025, both sides were exchanging fire on a near-monthly basis. By mid-2025, with the second Trump administration just installed, the pattern had become a feature of the international system rather than an anomaly. Negotiations have been attempted. Negotiations have stalled. Sanctions have been added. Sanctions have been waived. Hostages have been released. Hostages have been taken. We are recording this in the spring of 2026. The pattern continues. 73 years after Operation Ajax, 47 years after the embassy was taken, 6 years after the drone strike at Baghdad airport, 4 years after Mahsa Amini died in the back of a van, 2 years after the first direct missile exchange, the story does not end. It accumulates. Tonight we have walked through 75 years. We have walked from a phone call in Washington in 1953 to a coup in Tehran one summer night in August, to the long, quiet years of the Shah's restoration, to the cassette tapes that traveled faster than any television broadcast, to the wall of an embassy that was climbed in autumn, to a desert where 8 Americans died for nothing, to a cake and a Bible delivered with a plane load of missiles, to the burning wreckage of a passenger plane in the Persian Gulf, to a windowless room in Vienna where a deal was signed, and another room in Washington where it was torn up, to a pair of black sedans on an airport access road in Baghdad, to a young woman who would not survive a hijab inspection. If you want a single sentence to take with you, here it is. The United States and Iran have spent 75 years pretending they are in conflict over ideologies, and the truth is that almost every chapter of the story has actually been about oil, sovereignty, miscalculation, and memory. The ideologies are the language the two states use to talk about everything else. Almost every American president since Eisenhower has inherited a deeper version of the same problem. Each one has tried, in his own way, to solve it. None of them have. Eisenhower thought Mossadegh was a communist. Carter thought the Shah was stable. Reagan thought a secret arms deal would stay secret. The first Bush thought he could ignore the wreckage. Clinton thought he could finesse it. The second Bush thought a war in Iraq would solve it. Obama thought a deal could survive him. Trump thought maximum pressure would force capitulation. Biden thought re-entry would be technical. The pattern of presidential miscalculation is now so consistent that it deserves to be named. It is the gravity well of American foreign policy. Every administration falls in. Every administration thinks it has invented a new way out. The Iranian government has, in its own way, been just as stuck. It has built itself around its grievance against the United States. The grievance, after 75 years, is now constitutional architecture. It cannot be released because the regime would have to release with it the legitimacy that the grievance provides. The slogan, "Death to America," is not primarily a foreign policy. It is a domestic ritual. It is what holds the building up. The two states are locked in a relationship that neither of them can leave. They have been locked there since August 19th, 1953. They will be locked there, in some form, until something profound changes inside one of the two countries. In the meantime, real people pay the cost. The 290 souls of Iran, Air 655. The 52 American hostages who returned home and never spoke about it. The 500,000 Iranian conscripts who died in the Iran-Iraq War. The Mahsa Aminis, the Iranian middle class that no longer exists. The Marines at Beirut barracks. The Americans whose names appear on the long, classified list of casualties from EFP attacks in Iraq. The Iranian women in Evin prison. The Iranian Jews who left. The Iraqi conscripts who were gassed. The Lebanese civilians caught in proxy wars they did not start. History is, ultimately, a record of names. The names this story leaves behind are the only thing about it that is not, in some way, repeatable. The pattern repeats. The names do not. When you look at this 75-year arc, what do you see? A misunderstanding? A grudge? Or two systems doing exactly what they were designed to do? Drop your answer in the comments. I read everyone. I will give you mine in the next video. This was the entire history of US and Iran. I am Calder. If you found something tonight that you were not expecting, follow this channel so the next sleep documentary finds you when you need it most. Good night, magnates. Sleep well.